your right to vote is soaked in blood.
Mm.
It's soaked in blood of your ancestors who fought for this right. So how dare you not use it?
Um, we just felt like this was a good moment to reflect on our collaborations. We
Mm-hmm.
work on this periodic, like, guerrilla performance art piece called Slavery Made Plain. And of course, Cheyney, you are the mastermind and like the center of the performance piece. And I just sort of tag along. But yeah, we just wanted to like reflect on like all the performances that we've done and like
Mm-hmm.
think about where you want to go in the future with this project.
Right.
So I guess where should we start? I guess I want to start about how we met.
Right.
How did we meet?
I think we were talking about this a little while ago. I think that you reached out to me.
I did. I stalked you actually. That's let's just call it like it is. I stalked you. I loved your video, the first video you did on tutorials on head wraps.
Oh yeah.
And I
Oh, the
shared
rough days.
exactly. And I shared it on my Facebook page.
Hmm.
And after I shared it, I was like, I have to reach out to this person. I just love their work. Like this is like, you know, an embodied version of what I'm doing. And so I reached out to you, and thankfully you weren't like, who is this freak? You actually.
No. As soon as I got your email, I looked at your work and was like, this lines up so much with what I want to embody in my life as well as in my work. And really, honestly, I had been thinking about the intersection of style, fashion, and enslavement and enslaved African bodies. And you just dared to set your research on that. And I just thought, I was like, yes, this is a person that I need to connect with, that I need to be doing stuff with because we just lined up. And then when we met, it was like we talked for hours. And it was like we knew each other it felt like we knew each other for years. And I was like, this is a really cool situation. And we had said we were going to try to do something, but as usual, I was like, I don't know if it'll happen. But I think within a month, you were like, let's do something.
Exactly. I remember that meeting very clearly. Like there's some memories that sort of like get fuzzy as time goes by, but I remember us meeting. We met in Harlem. I remember
Hmm.
you were wearing a Victoria Beckham dress. You had
Oh, yes.
you had on a head wrap. We
Hmm.
went to Silvana. I
We
remember all the
did.
details.
Oh my gosh.
So we meet, and then like a few months later, we decide to like actually do something.
Hmm.
So let's talk about Slavery Made Plain. Where do we start? Like I think it was just like our excuse to work together. Like we need to
Yes.
collaborate some kind of way.
And I also feel like at the time we were a little bit, also, I was in a very interesting place in my career because I was solidly in the reenacting world, and I was trying to find a way to not get out of it, but to expand a bit more and to bring different people into what I'm trying to talk about. And also, I was worried about if I should go further into activism because a lot of my base was actually heavily conservative reenactors.
Mm.
And so I was very worried about what type of impact that would have on my career or whatever. And then at some point we were talking and I was like, let's do this.
Yeah, you're in a moment where you were trying to think more creatively about
Hmm.
historical interpretation and reenactment.
Hmm.
And I felt like, we met at that right moment. Also, I was in a transition period as well. So it worked out really well. So we decided to partner on we call it a guerrilla performance piece.
Yes. Really, I remember like distinctly we had to build all of this from scratch because I don't think there has ever been anything like it. Most of the people who you see using clothing of enslaved or even doing performance pieces with the clothing of 18th or 19th century clothing, they did not come from a living history background.
Mm.
Usually they come from an art background or an activism background. But I came solidly from living history, and I was really excited about using clothing and material culture to tell a story.
It was, I think the exact date was July 4th,
Hmm.
2017.
It was. Oh my goodness, 2017.
2017.
That
Yeah,
was so long
it's been,
ago.
I know. And it's we met in the evening because you had another job that you were working at Federal Plaza, remember?
Oh my goodness, I did. I was doing an interpretation at Federal Hall. And so I was like, y'all, we got to do this early. And so I did. I came fully in costume, which back then I used to travel around in costume just because changing clothing in a nasty New York City bathroom, I'm, I'm not, I'm not about that life. I am not.
And so we had multiple stops that day. We started out
Hmm.
in Federal Hall,
Hmm.
and you stood on the steps of Federal Hall,
Hmm.
next to, I think, the statues of Alexander Hamilton or
Yeah.
one of the founding fathers. And you stood there for about maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Hmm.
And just to like paint a picture of that day, I mean, it's July 4th. It was a beautiful day. It
Hmm.
was hot as hell. And we're in Lower Manhattan. It was teeming with tourists.
Uh-huh.
Like there were people everywhere. There are a lot of eyes on you.
There were, and I think I find that New Yorkers are very open to learning New Yorkers, so native New Yorkers. The pushback usually we get is actually from tourists,
Hmm.
people who are not native New Yorkers. And it's not like a Southern thing or a Northern thing. It is like no matter where they're from, I find that it's the tourists they feel very inconvenienced that I have ruined their Fourth of July with, conversations of uh, what to what to the slave is the Fourth of July, and that was the sign that I was holding. So, which is from Frederick Douglass, and I distinctly remember this sign. It was wood. I got a beautiful piece of wood. I painted it, and I used stencils. And it was also I find that the act of actually making the sign is a part of the ritual of the performance piece. I try to use items and period correct items and actually making the sign. So it's a whole aspect of I ritualize each of the programs that we do. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed. Like the signage is really important for you,
Hmm.
and you use the same color and you use the same font for all the signs. And that's something I had noticed. I was going back over the photos of all the performances that we did. Like it's
Right.
uniform. Like, you have a look for
Yeah.
each of the signs. And so we started off at Federal Hall, and then we moved on to. So Federal Hall is like literally on Wall Street,
Yes.
and it's right down the street from one of the Trump buildings, and it says Trump
Hmm.
right over the front of it, like in big letters. And so
Uh-huh.
we actually went to the Trump building and just hung out in front of the Trump building for a moment.
Yeah. Until we got run off.
So we got runoff.
Yeah. But I thought it would just be really interesting to have a few conversations with people in front of the Trump building. And it was very interesting.
It was, yeah. Um, in fact, I mean, just to paint more of a picture, because it's not like you're just hanging out, chatting and talking, and like
Right, 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 right.
kikiing in front of these buildings. Like, I stand back and just kind of let you hold the
Yeah.
sign, and you're just sort of there solemnly, like engaging with people. And most people don't really engage; they sort of look out of the corner of their eye and like keep it moving. But occasionally, someone will stop and like you have a conversation with them. It's interesting the conversations that you end up having with Black people, though.
Yes. People first, usually I get a yes, sister, yes, yes. And then and then it's interesting because they're the people who really want to go a little bit deeper um, into the connections of what's going on. So, and did you hear on the news what happened? um, but I also find that Black parents were bringing their Black children up to me, and they just stood them in front of me and was like, "Y'all listen."
Mm.
And I was also I was very honored for those moments. A little bit nervous because I really didn't prepare much of any a speech or anything. It was really supposed to be something that people can look and engage with. I was hoping people would ask a few questions, but knowing any interpreter, I know there are probably interpreters out there. There's not much you can do to shut us up. So like, so like I was like, I don't have a speech prepared, but anyway. So that was actually really, that was something that I was really excited about. I think it was in front of the next stop that we got those parents that were like, children, listen.
Exactly. We stopped off at the I don't know the exact name of the statue, but when I describe it, you're gonna know what I'm talking about. There's a large bull in the financial district in Lower Manhattan,
Mhm.
and we stopped there. And of course, there's always tourists because it's kind of like an iconic like tourist attraction. But with you standing in front of it, it really changes the meaning of the art piece. And
Right.
because there are so many tourists around it, they were interested in what was going on, what you were doing, why you're
Mhm.
dressed like that, and that's when you sort of engage with a lot of children.
Absolutely. It actually was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. We actually were worried about security. Um,
Um,
that's
yeah.
why this first performance, we had like five people with us,
Yeah.
and I wanted to make sure that people weren't intimidated. So I mean, what does that mean? But like, so I made sure that everyone was at least 10 feet away from me, people that I was with, so that people could engage. But they were close enough that they could hear what was going on. So if need be, they could step in. But security first, but it worked out very well.
It did. Yeah. And then we also
The little
went
girl.
to the site of the oh yeah, the little girl was just
Hmm.
near the bull. But then we also went to the site of the slave market in Lower Manhattan. And it was
Uh,
July 4th, so there were a lot of like booze cruises. Do
oh no.
you remember that? There were a lot of
Yeah,
drunk.
I remember that. I remember because at no time did I. That was the only time that it got sketchy because there was a lot of like really drunk bros,
Yeah.
and um, and then I did hear like sometimes as I passed, there was only one or two people who said something to me, but some people I could hear out as I was passing people a little bit of, being disgruntled, trying to have a good time, and always got to bring up slavery. So I heard some of those, but not many people were bold enough to actually speak it out.
And so we spent maybe 20 minutes there, and
Mm-hmm.
then we walked to Francis Tavern, where we sort of ended the performance.
Yeah.
And we actually had dinner there too.
Yeah, that was really nice. But we did get to speak to people out front of Francis Tavern, which was really nice. A lot of things that people didn't know about Francis Tavern. This is the site where people that the British were determining which of these Black people's names are going into the Book of Negroes, meaning that they're going to get a spot in these ships to get evacuated. Because remember, those who were left behind were getting re-enslaved. We have General George Washington sending many a letter to the British saying, "Remember our property, bring our property back." So I think that's actually one of my favorite sites in New York City, Francis Tavern, just because I have dreams about that time. For some people, Evacuation Day is an exciting day. For others, it was terrifying.
So that was the first performance, July 4th, 2017. And then, let me go to my notes here and see. The next performance was on, let's see.
Federal Hall? No,
Federal Plaza.
Immigration Court. Mm-hmm.
The Immigration Court. That was on September 21st, 2018. Yeah. So what was going on around that time? Why did we choose the Immigration Court?
There's a lot of reasons, but mainly those babies, those children who were being taken from their parents and kept in cages. I know that is a buzz term, but for me, every time I think about that, I always thought about the enslaved mothers at the end of slavery. There were hundreds, thousands of enslaved parents who were looking for their children. And the desperation and the work that went into it, I can only imagine, is that what these parents are going through now? And the sheer indifference people had to these parents trying to retrieve their children, it's very similar to the indifference that people have toward these people who were seeking freedom and safety in America, what they were going through. How frantic you must have been. How terrifying is that to want to find your children, but you hear all these stories of things that are being done to these children. And so that was something that I thought would be to draw these connections to a parent 150 years ago who was looking for her children. And I came across the Christian Recorder, which was a newspaper during the time. And they actually provided free spots in their publication to formerly enslaved parents who were looking for their children at the time that they were emancipated. And it's just reading those accounts is just so heart-wrenching. It's the same feeling I get when I read the accounts of immigrant parents who are looking for their children who have been detained, taken from them. And I just really, also at this point, there was a bit of a lull in the calls and the outrage of children in cages. We had been living in that reality for months by that period. And I was frustrated that people, we had gotten desensitized to the fact that children had been taken from their parents. And children were being kept in cages or in deplorable conditions to this day, we have children in these conditions. And I was just so frustrated that nobody was taking it. It felt like there were people taking it serious, but the public at large had kind of been like desensitized themselves to the situation and the outrage of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
And at no point has my outrage lessened. I am still as furious today as I was in 2018.
We did this on a weekday during work hours.
Yeah.
And the idea was for us to actually go into the courthouse. We had a plan to actually go through security and go into not the courtroom, but a space within the actual courthouse as a form of protest. And we were sort of thwarted in that effort by the security. They saw all of our equipment and they were like,
they were like, nah. And there's a picture of me like.
But I remember we had a lot of conversations around right before we did this, because one, we just worried about the legality of it. Like, we're both Black people in the United States, and we don't have records and we don't want to have records.
Right.
So we were just worried that we might get arrested. So that was one conversation that we had. But another conversation that we had was, it's also a space where people celebrate achieving American citizenship. Like, you literally see people coming from the American citizenship ceremony with their American flags. And we also didn't
dress nicely.
And we didn't kind of want to ruin that moment for people, because it wasn't a critique of people choosing to become American citizens. It was a critique of the Trump administration and the way they were handling immigration policy.
And I distinctly remember that I had doubts about whether or not we should have stationed ourselves at immigration court, or I should say ICE offices. So where we were, ICE is housed in that building, but it also happens to be immigration court as well in the same building. So we were there to protest ICE and their actions, but also there's also a very celebratory atmosphere, which we wanted to, maintain that atmosphere for those people who work so hard to become American citizens, but at the same time critique those who are being trifling.
Exactly. So we didn't end up actually entering the courthouse, unfortunately, but what we did was we were able to go around the corner and stand in front of the building as a form of protest.
Yeah.
And you actually had a number of really powerful conversations with people in that space. So that was amazing. It was one of the times where you really made the connection between past injustices and current forms of oppression, which is the whole point of this performance piece. It's not about thinking about history. The work that we're doing is not about reflecting on the past necessarily. It's using the past to learn about the current moment and sort of construct a more positive future.
Yeah, and just say, this is not new.
Right.
Why haven't we learned our lessons? That's really Slavery Made Plain It's just our questioning society and our country. We've already learned these lessons. Why are we repeating these? Why are we repeating these things? I don't understand it. And so that's kind of what Slavery Made Plain as a whole is like. Can we learn these lessons?
Right, exactly. And also, I just think it was a really powerful image of you standing in front of the courthouse. I think visually, aesthetically, just on that level, it was also really striking as well. And then, so the next performance was, let's see, it's funny, I had to like really do some digging through my camera roll to get these dates because it's funny, we just did it. We just did it. And so now reflecting on it, it's like, what did we actually do? And when did we actually do it?
I cannot believe we did so many of these.
But yeah, just to go back to my notes, on October 19th, 2018 was the third Slavery Made Plain performance. And we did that on 125th Street in Harlem.
Yeah.
The thought process behind that performance was thinking about, it was in the lead up to the congressional election. So it was about voter registration.
Really driving home the importance of voter registration and a saying my mom always had. Those of you who know me and Mama McKnight and Papa McKnight, something that they repeat over and over and over again, your right to vote is soaked in blood. It's soaked in blood of your ancestors who fought for this right, so how dare you not use it? And so I don't really like to be preachy because I feel that being preachy really shuts people down and shuts down the conversation, but really standing as a reminder to specifically people in my community. So 125th Street is like, I like to call it the heart of Harlem. It's like smack dab in the middle. It's more diverse now, but it's still a very large Black community. And it's usually where Black people come to shop in Harlem. You see all types of people there. And it was just a place where I could go and, connect with the Black community and say, this is important. Let's get out and vote. And just in case you forgot the date, here it is.
But also, you live in Harlem, and your parents live in Harlem.
Yeah.
And we met in Harlem. So there's a lot of significance there, just for us and for you, just individually.
Absolutely.
But one thing that struck me about that performance, and about all performances actually, but it's just like the juxtaposition between old and new.
Yeah.
So, for whatever reason, being on 125th Street on that particular day, seeing you in full like garb, but 125th Street, which is like we're right near an H&M and like other sort of like quote modern places.
Right. Down the street from the Apollo. Okay.
Exactly. All the street vendors were out again. It was fall, but it was still pretty warm. So everyone was out in the streets, and the street vendors were selling their things, and it was a busy day. Like there was a constant stream of people passing you, and so you were able to like engage with a number of people, have some really important conversations with people, and because it's a Black space, I feel like the kind of conversations you were able to have were different.
Absolutely, it was. Whereas I find that against popular belief, Black people know a lot about slavery. I think there's this like weird belief that Black people don't know anything about slavery. Let me tell you, having been to like all types of Black functions, we talk about slavery all the time. we know about slavery. So being able to not have to explain the basics of slavery before going on to higher level conversations was actually really nice. Which I find that, and as it is my job to talk to people and educate people, so I don't necessarily mind having to explain the basic history of slavery. It's just nice to be able to get to a higher conversation without having to do the whole explaining beforehand.
I mean, this is something we talk about a lot, but it can be pretty exhausting. But like you said, like I feel like Black folks, because they're often descendants of enslaved peoples themselves, they're familiar with that history. Even if they haven't studied it on an academic level, they just know from like family stories and oral histories or experience what it might feel like to be an enslaved person. Right. And I feel like with other people, you really have to start from like zero. But when you're starting with someone who might have some experience or knowledge in this area, you can start at 50% or 75%. Like when I have to, sometimes I'll explain my research to people and they'll be like, really? Is there really a relationship between fashion and slavery? Like, is that actually a thing? and I feel like I rarely have to have that conversation with Black people. It's always like, of course that's a thing. Like, of course people have to like make a way out of no way. Like they have to find beauty in even the most harrowing situations. So I just feel like the kind of conversations that you can have, it's different when a person of African descent.
Absolutely, and I also feel like there's a personal in it because I think. As a protective, I think a lot of white people have disconnected themselves personally from slavery. It was not me or my ancestor, it was those people, the bad people. Whereas for me, I proudly embrace like my ancestors and the fact that I am a direct descendant from enslaved people. And I do find that other Black people do as well. So it's also a completely different conversation if you are talking about your ancestors. I find that when I talk to people who are direct descendants of enslavers, and have acknowledged and accepted that, I have a completely different conversation with them as well. It's a more honest and genuine conversation, and I find it's a lot deeper. But, people may not be there yet.
Exactly. Can I share a little anecdote from that day, actually?
Oh, yeah. I know what you're asking.
You know what I'm going to say?
So, go ahead.
So funny enough, while we're doing this performance, I'm like standing back, like taking photos, and Cheyney is doing her thing, like engaging with people, holding a sign, and Ruth E. Carter comes up and is like, well, first I think we saw her like maybe like a few minutes before.
Yeah, we did.
And I like pulled you aside. I was like, that's Ruth E. Carter. And for those who don't know, Ruth E. Carter is a famed, like Academy Award winning costume designer. Who did the
designer for Black Panther.
Exactly. And for like Do the Right Thing and Amistad and like period Black films, but also like modern day Black films. So she's like the go-to like Black costume designer. And she was right there on 125th Street, I guess part of like a film crew that was taking a break. And she took a photo of Cheyney and posted it on her Instagram.
And, I was trying to keep my cool. Because she said she complimented my dress. She was like, she touched my dress. And was like, what fabric is this? This is amazing. And she's like, oh my God, she's touching me. And also, she was very fascinated with my jacket, the story behind the jacket, and my shoes. So I just remember I felt a sense of accomplishment because I spend a lot of time and effort in developing the material culture around my costuming and clothing, historical garb. So to have someone like her who tells stories with clothing, for her to be able to pick up right away and what I was trying to say and do, it just was like, it just felt this affirmation. It was really amazing. And also we had like a black girl magic moment. Like, I will remember it for the rest of my life. I don't know if she will remember me, but I certainly will.
Well, if she doesn't remember, it's on her Instagram account. So anytime she scrolls through her history, like it's right there. All the likes and comments.
Right. I love it.
One thing I love about your practice and your styling is that your clothing are like texts. And like anyone who knows me knows that I always repeat this over and over again ad nauseum, but like textiles and texts have the same roots. And you can read what you're wearing like a text. Like each piece of jewelry, each garment, each textile, each head wrap, the footwear, even like the petticoats, like all of it has a meaning. And you can sit down and like have a whole conversation. And I think it goes back to your interpreting like background.
Absolutely. I think I was very lucky. Shout out to Marvin Greer. I was very lucky that I started reenacting with interpreters who had felt that costuming had much deeper meaning than just putting on some clothing to go reenacting. We are very reverent with this clothing, because to me, personally to me, this is a direct connection I have to my ancestors. I feel that I am, in a way, wrapping them around me when I'm wearing them. And so I think it has such significance. And I'm very grateful that I started with people who were very adamant about the importance of material culture and clothing.
So maybe let's talk about one of the last performances that you did, which was, let me go to my notes. It was on April 6th, 2019, and you stood in front of the Brooklyn Museum on First Saturdays. For those who don't know, First Saturdays at the Brooklyn Museum is a day when the museum is free and open to the public. And it's normally, families come, like teenagers, like people who just want to go to the museum and not pay the like $15 to get in to see the exhibitions. So it's normally a very busy day in front of the museum.
It's a day where even people who can afford to pay the crazy amount, it's not crazy. At $15 for a museum, it's not crazy amount. Support your museum. But people who can afford still come on first Mondays, because it's a place to be seen. It's a place to interact with people around New York City. That's like the place where I always run into a lot of different people when I'm there on those particular days. And I think it was a good day. It was a good day to go. How did you feel about the day?
I thought it went really well. Like, we set up shop like right by the exit of the subway. So anyone coming off the subway had to pass you. And so, and you had a sign that I think it essentially said, like, let's have a conversation about slavery. Let's talk about slavery.
Yeah. And I had a table. I have a bar, which I sewed a linen tablecloth. And I put a wooden sign out front, and I said, let's talk about slavery. And I had all types of laminates prepared. I had all types of touch objects. I had a shelf underneath my table that I could whip stuff out. if things needed to be interpreted or talked about more deeply. I know I said each one is my favorite, but this definitely was my favorite.
Someone whose username is 18th Century, which I think is like a great username, had a question about how they said, how do the conversations you have begin? Is it always because people approach you? What do people often say to start those conversations? And they said that the project is so powerful and inspiring.
Oh, thank you. I try to let people approach me. We've had many conversations about where to station me. It's nice to be stationed near a high foot traffic area, but other times it's not a good thing. Because I want people to feel completely comfortable coming up to me and talking, and they may not feel comfortable talking to me about slavery in front of an audience. If you do not have a PhD in Africana studies, you're not going to have the vocabulary to feel that I'm saying everything politically correct and no one's going to be offended by what I'm saying. And I just want to provide people with a space that even if they don't have the correct language, they can feel safe in just coming up and talking to us, which is my job. It's my job. And so from years of experience, I know that in high traffic areas, they're going to go up to George Washington, they'll go up to Mickey Mouse, but they're not going to come up to me because all eyes are usually on the woman that looks enslaved. And they will feel that all eyes are then on them talking to me. So sometimes we'll put, and we've learned this over time, right? That I probably should be, if we're wanting to do a Let's Talk About Slavery program, it should probably be off to the side somewhere, but we were really in a high traffic area. So to answer your question, usually people come up to me. A lot of interactions start in different ways. Sometimes it is, tell me about slavery. It's just coming out and I'm like, oh, okay. Okay, 400 years and 2 minutes.
Okay, we have a few comments here. Someone wanted us to talk about the word change from slave to enslaved. So I use enslaved maybe 70 to 75% of the time. I'm not super strict about it because I think you have to think about, how do I say this? I think if someone uses the word slave, they're not automatically stripping an individual of their agency and their identity. But I do think it's important. I think it's an important conversation, and I do think we should, whenever possible, use enslaved. But sometimes I will use slave because, one, like I already use enslaved in the sentence, and I don't want to say enslaved twice in the sentence, or just to like change up the word. So it's more of like a stylistic decision that I make as opposed, but if it's when it's appropriate and if it works in a sentence, I always use enslaved. And the thought about that is to, when you call an individual a slave, as opposed to an enslaved person, you're emphasizing that it's a condition that's imposed on an individual, as opposed to being a slave, which sort of is their total identity.
Yeah. And I think when I do programs with children, because we now know what enslaved person means, when I'm talking to children, I'll say, she was an enslaved person or slave, because they know what a slave is, but I want them to learn the correct language. So to begin with, I will use both. together in the sentence. And then from then on, I'll use enslaved person. And then, but I also, funny stories when when I was working at a site, not being specific, we got so into using enslaved person, that people started using the enslaved cabin, the enslaved pen. No. Like, I was just like, it is okay to use like, this is at the period, this was a slave pen, or this is the slave house or slave cabin. Like, these are what these things are. And I also use things like enslaver instead of slave holder or slave owner. I think using slave holder is a cop-out because it sounds like I'm just holding them. I do use, so children who inherit slaves, I will use a slave owner instead of enslaver. But once they become an active participant of enslaving people, they become an enslaver. So George Washington, when he inherited enslaved persons, I call him a slave holder or a slave owner. So once he starts buying and selling and actively engaging in enslaving people, he's an enslaver.
Exactly. And I think these conversations are really important because language has power, and language sort of reinforces identities. So it's important to have conversations about word choice because we might be inadvertently reinscribing or reifying violence against enslaved peoples. I want to talk about an experience that we had when we were doing like an exploratory trip for a potential slavery made plain. We had this idea of doing like a slavery made plain similar to the one that we had done on July 4th. It was like a walking tour, like visiting different sites of enslavement in Lower Manhattan. And we walked around and we visited multiple sites, and it never got off the ground for whatever reason. But one of the places that we visited was this really bougie coffee shop in Tribeca called La Colombe. And La Colombe was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad.
An actual stop.
An actual stop.
Not the fake stops around New York. I'm sorry, I'm being shady. I'm sorry.
And so we went to the coffee shop, and we actually bought like, some coffee and a pastry or something. And then we went up to the manager and we were like, so this is a stop on the Underground Railroad. And they were actually aware of it. Like we weren't telling them something they didn't know. Right. And we were like, can we go into the basement and actually see where enslaved peoples were kept? And the manager was like, I don't know. We're not sure if it's safe. Like I don't know if our insurance covers that. And we're like, please. So they actually let us go down there, and we were able to go down into the basement of this coffee shop and see the space where enslaved peoples, escaped to gain freedom. And that was a really powerful experience that we had, and I really wish that they were able to really. I think there's a plaque outside of the coffee shop around the corner from the facade. But you really can't go down there on a regular basis to like visit the space. It's really just like the coffee shop storage area.
It is, and it was very powerful. Also, very eye-opening because it's very spacious. It looks very much like a 19th century cellar. Whereas like most of these stops on the Underground Railroad that people say are stops are actually just, small storage areas or even during the 20s or places where things would have been hidden much later. But I think it was just something that really drove home, and the feeling was there. It was the atmosphere. I think that was just one of a very memorable situation because we were there at the right time on the right day, because I've heard from other people that they do not allow people down there.
Wow.
Like we caught that guy at the right time, and he let us down.
Someone asked, what's the name of the coffee shop? It's La Colombe Torrefaction. It's on Church Street in Tribeca.
Mm-hmm.
Someone asked, I wish art museums were working with both of you more. Why do you think that they're not? That's a good question. I mean, we've done work with cultural institutions individually, but also jointly. Like we gave a talk at the Brooklyn Library for the 1619 project. We also I put on a conference at Weeksville Heritage Center, and Cheyney gave a talk at that conference. And what else have we done together? I was on your YouTube channel, but yeah, I wonder why. I mean, that's a question that I mean we need to continue pondering. Yeah, we both love to work with more art museums.
Yeah, because I do consider myself a performance artist. So like, I kind of get pushed more into historical interpretation. Also as an artist, as opposed to when I'm doing historical interpretation, which is you kind of know what you're going to get. So when sites bring me in, they know what I'm going to talk about. But as an artist, when you bring me in as an artist, I'm an artist, and I expect to be able to create my art the way, I need to and want to create my art. So I think that's a bit of a difference between coming into historical institutions. I'm going to think about that.
Yeah, that's something I really would challenge you to do more of. Like, you are an artist, and you're such a creative mind, and that I would love to see you doing more performance pieces, whether it's like actual performance pieces, but like plays as well. Because I mean, I think at the heart of what you're doing is that you're putting your body on the line, and that's what I mean. Considering the news that's been going on nationwide, like it's just like one of the conditions of being a Black person is putting your body on the line. There's a performance artist named Coco Fusco, and she wrote this piece called "Our Bodies Were Never Ours," and I feel like you're sort of grappling with that idea in your work, and I would really love to see you sort of like lean into that more.
Well, I love how you led into that, because that's kind of some next steps that will be taken.
I would love to get to this last question. There's an interpreter watching, and they're saying that when they talk about slavery, the people often change the subject, and they're wondering if you ever experienced that, and do you have any advice for dealing with that?
Absolutely. That is something, especially when people come to sites that they did not expect, that number one, they were going to get a Black woman taking them around the site. Number two, they weren't expecting to come to the site and learn about enslaved people. They were expecting to learn about white people. And so they're really upset sometimes, or they're just, I didn't come here for this. So sorry about it. That's what you're going to get. Also, it's the craft of interpretation. At a site that I used to work at, we used to do a game called Get It Back to Slavery, where you bring up any object, a fan, an interpreter can interpret this thing and bring it all the way back, where we talk about women, where we talk about men, where we talk about enslaved persons, we talk about households, we talk about interactions between people. And that's kind of playing games like that, or interpretive games, I find really help to hone that skill. I hope that helps. I know.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, I feel like that should be the theme of this entire conversation. Bring it back to slavery.
No matter what, I could bring anything back to slavery, because they be trying to duck and dodge my interpretation. They're like, I'm like, oh, you about to get this.
I mean, that's why we're friends. Like I'm the same way. For me, it's always about slavery. Like I feel like it's so foundational to American history. So I just want to say thank you so much for I always enjoy talking to you. It's like talking to like a family member. So, you know, always just have a pleasure. We get together and we just chat it up and kiki.
Exactly.
So thank you so much. So I'm just gonna. I
Thank
love
you,
you. Thank you
Cheyney. I
so
love
much.
you.
Enjoy the